48. Somewhere after the crucifixion, Peter and his friend Paul went off to Antioch, then on to Rome, and they began the movement that became Christianity. But as recorded in the other annals, Jesus, his brother James and the majority of the other apostles continued the Nazarene movement and progressed it into Europe. It became the Celtic Church. The Nazarene movement as a church is documented within the Celtic Church records as being formally implemented as the Church of Jesus in AD 37, 4 years after the crucifixion. The Roman Church was formed 300 years later, after Paul and Peter's Christians had been persecuted for 3 centuries. Through many centuries the Nazarene-based Celtic Church movement was directly opposed therefore to the Church of Rome. The difference was a simple one. The Nazarene faith was based on the teachings of Jesus himself. The guts of the religion, the moral codes, the behavioral patterns, the social practices, the laws and justices related to Old Testament teaching but with a liberal message of equality in mind. This was the religion of Jesus. Roman Christianity is church unity. It was not the message of Jesus that was important. This church turned Jesus into the religion. In short, the Nazarene Church was the true social church. The Roman Church was the church of the emperors and the popes. This was the imperial hybrid movement. Apart from straightforward misunderstandings, misinterpretations and mistranslations, the canonical Gospels suffer from numerous purposeful amendments. Some original entries have been changed or deleted. Other entries have been added to suit the Church's vested interest. Back in the 4th century, when the texts were translated into Latin from their original Greek and Semitic tongues, the majority of these edits and amendments were made. Even earlier, about AD 195–1800 years ago, Bishop Clement of Alexandria made the first known amendment from the Gospel texts. He deleted a substantial section from the Gospel of Mark, written more than 100 years before that time, and he justified his action in a letter. For even if they should say something true, one who loves the truth should not agree with them. For not all true things are to be said to all men. Interesting. What he meant was that even at that very early stage there was already a discrepancy between what the Gospel writers had written and what the bishops wanted to teach. Today, this section deleted by Saint Clement is still missing from the Gospel of Mark. But when Mark is compared with the Gospel that we know today, even without that section we find that today's Gospel is a good deal longer than the original. One of these additional sections comprises the whole of the resurrection sequence. This amounts to 12 full verses at the end of Mark, chapter 16. It's now known that everything told about the events after the crucifixion was added by church bishops or their scribes sometime in the late 4th century. Although this is confirmed in the Vatican archives, it is difficult for most people to gain access, and even if they do, Old Greek is very difficult to understand. But what exactly was in this section of Mark that Clement saw fit to remove? It was the section that dealt with the raising of Lazarus. In the context of the original Mark text, however, Lazarus was portrayed in a state of excommunication, spiritual death by decree, not physical death. The account even had Lazarus and Jesus calling to each other before the tomb was opened. This defeated the bishop's desire to portray the raising of Lazarus as a spiritual miracle, not as a simple release from excommunication. More importantly, it set the scene for the story of the crucifixion of Jesus himself, whose own subsequent raising from spiritual death was determined by the same 3-day rule that applied to Lazarus. Jesus was raised, released or resurrected from death by decree on the statutory 3rd day. In the case of Lazarus, however, Jesus flouted the rules by raising his friend after the 3-day period of symbolic sickness. At that point, civil death would have become absolute in the eyes of the legal elders. Lazarus would have been wrapped in sacking and buried alive. His crime was that he had led a violent people's revolt to safeguard the public water supply, which had been diverted through a new Roman aqueduct in Jerusalem. But Jesus performed this release while not holding any priestly entitlement to do so. What happened was that Herod Antipas of Galilee compelled the high priest of Jerusalem to relent in favor of Jesus, and this was regarded as an unprecedented miracle. But there was more to the removed section of Mark, because in telling the story of Lazarus, the Mark account made it perfectly clear that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were actually man and wife. The Lazarus story in John contains a rather strange sequence that has Martha coming from the Lazarus house to greet Jesus, whereas her sister, Mary Magdalene, remains inside until